Now we are going to see how to work with Mongo clusters. You will learn how to create, grow, shrink, delete, and add users and databases to the cluster. Let's begin by clicking on the cluster link on the left under Databases, and then Launch Cluster. Next, provide the name. Let's call it Mongo Cluster 1. Then choose the data store and specify the flavor. In this example, we will use a volume size of 5 GB. Choose Have a Shard and 3 replica sets. Next, click on the Launch button. Let's wait for the cluster build to complete. Now you can see the Mongo cluster. So, to see the contents, you just click on the name. For more details, click on the instances. You can see the cluster has 3 members as expected. Mongo clusters are different from others. If you take a look at the contents again using the Nova view, you will see 5 items rather than 3. In addition to the 3 new ones, there is also a Mongo config server and a Mongo query router. And if you look at the IP address of the query router, you will see the entry point into the cluster. The Mongo cluster has a number of nodes. You use the query router, and it can take your request and work with the cluster. So now that you have the cluster configured, we'll use the CLI to create a user and a database. Type the following command to see the contents of the cluster. Use trovelist include cluster, since a trove list won't show anything unless you use the include cluster option. Now you can see the 3 replicas as elements, as well as the config server and the query router. Next, you will create a database and user. For this, you use the ID of the query router. You will create a user with the ID of the query router, username, and password. Mongo is unique in that a username must be in the form DB name, which is a database name, period, the username. In this case, we are going to create a database called DBA and a user called Matt with a password, password. To validate this user and the database, get the IP address of the query router. And that is 172.16.200.6. So let's do Mongo username is Matt with a password, password. The database is DBA. Now we can connect the database to the DBA database. What else can you do with the cluster? If your data and user load are growing, you might want to increase the cluster size. There are 2 ways to do this. If you are looking to grow the database, you might want to partition the data. One option is to add additional shards to distribute the data as your database grows. The other option is adding query routers. The query router is the entry point, so by adding additional ones, your application clients can access them to make requests to your database. Let's see how you can add additional shards to your Mongo cluster. First, click on the Grow Cluster button. And then Add Instance. Choose Trove Medium Flavor and a volume size of 5 gigs. Now create a shard and replica sets. Start with Mongo Cluster 1, Shard 2, Element 1. And for instance type, it's a replica. If it is a query router, just say query router. And it is related, since in a Mongo cluster you have a shard, and a shard has 3 replicas elements connected to it. You have to identify what is a shard and what is a replica set. Call the first one Mongo Cluster 1 rs2-1 as the shard name and add. Now add 2 more to this. Trove Medium 5 gig for the second one. And a third one. So now you have a shard and 3 replica set elements. Make sure the names are correct. rs2-1, rs2-2, rs2-3. They are all the same flavors, same volume. They're all replicas, and they are all connected to rs2-1. Next, click on this and grow cluster. Instead of 3 elements now, to 6 elements. You can see the cluster growth is complete. It now shows 6 instances. Next, we will show you how you shrink the cluster. Let's say you want to remove the original shards. You just try to remove one of the original shards. You get an error indicating that you can't remove it, then you have to remove the entire shard. Let's try to remove the entire shard. Now it will give an error message indicating that shard instance is still active. Please remove the shard from the Mongo cluster. If you were using Couchbase or Percona, you could remove a shard directly from there, but Mongo is different because of the shard concept. You have to remove the elements from the shard, make it inactive, and then you can shrink the cluster. Let's go to the command line and see how it can be done. So there are 2 shards. What we need to do is clean up the shards before we can remove them. It shows the 2 shards and their IP addresses. You are going to remove shard 1, the original shard. There are 2 shards, rs1 and rs2, with the IDs, so you are going to say remove shard rs1. Now it says draining has started. You have created a database but haven't put any data in it. If you have been using the database for a while and you have significant amount of data in there, removing the shard is going to take some amount of time, a day, 2 days, depending on how much data there is. Just because you are doing a remove shard does not mean it will go away immediately. So if you want to see progress, run the command again, and you will see not only draining ongoing, it says you need to move primary databases. It says you have a database called DBA, and you're going to move it off of primary. DB run command. Move primary database name. Run the DBA run command to move primary DBA to rs2. So we're moving it from rs1 to rs2. That portion is now complete. Now you can remove the shard completely. You'll see only RS2 shards, not RS1. So now you can remove the shard from the UI. Now keep in mind you will remove all 3 shards at the same time. Go back in there, go to Shrink, Shrink Cluster. Now you can see that the cluster shrink has completed. Now it's back to 3 instances. You can see that you only have the RS2, the shard2 elements in there. Now add a query router to that. You can once again click on Grow Cluster, Add Instance. Now you see that the Grow cluster has been completed. So let's take a look at the cluster elements. You can see 2 query routers, and if you do a Nova list, there are 2 and 6. So that's how you create, grow, shrink, and add query routers to the cluster.